Welcome to News from Neptune for June 21st in the 25th week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government a century ago, said, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." Remarkably enough, we seem to be verging on a discussion in this country of what the term socialist means. It's not easy, owing to generations of U.S. propaganda. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism, in Karl Marx's sense, in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, notably in Russia and China. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things on a killer's trial edition of News from Neptune. The trial or tryout we have in mind particularly is the Pentagon versus the neocons, not really about Trump in Iran. Trump approved military strikes against Iran, apparently, but pulled back after the planes were in the air, according to the New York Times. The order to halt attacks on Iranian radar and missile batteries came after intense debate at the White House among top security officials and congressional leaders. The commentator Kim.com imagines how the debate actually went down. Trump, attack Iran now. Pentagon General, Iran can sink our carrier strike group in the region. Trump, what? Pentagon General, if we strike Iran now, they can retaliate against thousands of U.S. sailors. Trump, WTF? Pentagon General, this isn't Syria, sir. Trump, call it off. I think .com may have the story right. Trump this morning wrote, on Monday, Iran shot down an unmanned drone flying in international waters. We were cocked and loaded, interesting phrase, to retaliate last night on 3 different sites. When I asked, sorry, I'm laughing, misspell sites. When I asked how many will die, 150 people, sir, was the answer from a general 10 minutes before the strike. I stopped it, not proportionate to shooting down an unmanned drone. I'm in no hurry. Our military is rebuilt, new, and ready to go, by far the best in the world. Sanctions are biting, and more added last night. Iran can never have nuclear weapons, not against the USA and not against the world. That's what Trump wrote, and if we read through that with something other than the conventional interpretations from the political establishment, it's clear that what the political establishment most fears about Trump, that he will interfere with the war provocations against Russia and China that have been the activities of all recent administrations, including, of course, Bush and Obama's. He attacked those during the campaign, and the fear by the political establishment in the U.S. is that he'll live up to those attacks. Now, in fact, in other words, he'll live up to the criticisms that he expressed in the campaign. In fact, in office, Trump has proved himself to be about the weakest American president since Calvin Coolidge, and the danger of his actually fulfilling his promises is probably small. But the action last night apparently does that, and it's driving the American political establishment nuts. It's a neocon-Pentagon war, really, that's being carried on within the administration right now. The neocons pressing for an attack on Iran, for another war against Iran. The U.S. has been torturing Iran for 70 years, and the American political establishment wants to continue that. And it's the Pentagon that's holding back. It's the Pentagon are saying it's simply undoable unless one wants to put up with massive American military losses in the Middle East. So on the real question of balance of power in the Mideast, it's a very interesting question indeed, and probably far less about Donald Trump than either he or his opponents think. Trump is largely irrelevant. It's a neocon Pentagon war. David, what's on your list?
Well, let me just make a couple of extraneous comments about that.
Okay.
Or questions even. Where do you think Netanyahu stands on all this? What do you think Israel's role, whether bellicose or more moderate, is on this? Is Netanyahu really as much of a windbag as Donald Trump is in this regard?
It's an interesting question. I think the short answer is probably yes, but it's more difficult, I think, to decide what the Israeli government really wants. Obviously, the government of Israel is beset with Iran's presence in the Middle East and would be very happy if it went away. The control of the Middle East that is shared by American clients like Israel and Saudi Arabia is challenged to some extent by Iran. And Iran, as is part of the Eurasian conglomeration that includes Russia and China. So it is indeed on the front line. Israel as an American client and Iran as a Eurasian client is the battle line drawn in the Middle East. I think that's true. What Israel wants out of that is not entirely clear. The destruction of Iran or the reduction of Iran to a pliable government may be the obvious goal of Israel, but in some sense, the continuation of the status quo ante serves
their interest better.
Exactly, right. Serves their interest better, first in terms of support by the United States, straight on military and economic support from the U.S., as the U.S. Is not being manipulated by Israel so much as regarding Israel as its stationary aircraft carrier and for American control of the Middle East. So American and Israeli interests, governmental interests here, are bound up together but are not exactly identical.
You know, I happened to run across an interview this week, I forget where, with Stephen Walt. He was being interviewed by somebody. Stephen Walt of Mearsheimer Walt fame, the book The Israel Lobby. And what Walt said in that book, perhaps not surprisingly, but whatever, he said he felt that the arguments that he and Mearsheimer made in the book The Israel Lobby regarding the lobby's control over U.S. foreign policy had been proven right in the years since that book was published. I believe that was in 2006. So in the 13 years, Walt he's sticking to his story.
I'm not sure I understand, David. You're saying Walt has been proved right, or he says he's been proved right?
He says he's been proved right. Yeah.
And you don't agree?
No, and Chomsky still would say that he was wrong and has been proven to be wrong.
I'm with you on this. I think that's true. I mean, the point that was taken from the very interesting study, and as a matter of fact, 10 years ago, called The Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Waltz, was that Israel was manipulating American policy, particularly in the Middle East, for its own interests, not in the interests in any sense of the United States. And that, as you say, serious commentators did not accept in spite of the degree of detail that Mearsheimer and Walt presented. And 10 years has not changed, I think, the opinion of that book that you and I and many others hold.
And I mean, it's convoluted because on the one hand, Israel is portrayed as being more bellicose than U.S. foreign policy in the region. But when push comes to shove, and not only because of Netanyahu's personal relationship with Donald Trump, but because of what you referred to, the idea that you maintain the temperature about 80, 85. You don't want it to get down to 60 where everybody's comfortable, and doesn't and can focus on something else like Israel's occupation of Palestine.
And the heating system is definitely oil fueled here too.
Yeah.
This is not the overriding interest of the United States in maintaining Israel as a client and maintaining a status quo ante, what Henry Kissinger called the overall framework of order in the Middle East, a framework of order which the U.S. controls with client governments, the Mideast in general. The interest in that is primarily an interest in controlling the energy flows out of the Persian Gulf. And that's an interesting question, too, because there's a sense in which that's becoming less important than it was even when Mearsheimer and Walt wrote. But the issue remains whether the U.S. is able to use the worldwide flows of energy, particularly those from the Persian Gulf, as an enemy against as a weapon against American enemies in the region. American enemies in this case, not only in the paramount case, China, but also in some sense American competitors in the EU. Germany, for example, the American hold on energy, on the world energy markets in general, seems to be slipping in some ways these days. But in fact, it's at a long time. It's of longstanding importance in the U.S. control of its economic rivals.
And the other little sidebar there has to do with Patrick Shanahan, recently deposed or departed as Defense Secretary, head of the Pentagon.
Right.
We've referred to Patrick Shanahan as he came from Boeing, and we've been talking about Boeing.
Right.
We've been talking about the relationship between the phenomenon of what happened to Boeing after it became a defense contractor as opposed to just a builder of private airplanes or corporate airplanes. I got my usual kick out of the often used phrase that he was leaving his job to spend more time with his family, especially, I think maybe Jeffrey St. Clair pointed that out this morning. He is known to have been, his wife has been known to have left him 10 years ago after an episode of domestic violence. Perhaps I shouldn't repeat these things without better proof, but I did.
Well, it's in the press if you look for it.
I read it on the internet.
Yeah, right.
So that gives spending time with one's family even more perverse humor than it usually has when people say that after they've been caught with various issues. But that aside, who's replacing Shanahan?
Exactly.
And what is there a reason, quote unquote, why Shanahan is gone? I mean, as horrible a person as I'm sure he is he being replaced by somebody even more politically worse in this sort of downward spiral that we see ever since Trump came into office?
Downward spiral?
Well, Pompeo and Bolton and people like that.
We're referring to the column by the editor of Counterpunch, Jeffrey Sinclair, and he has a number of interesting things in this morning's column. He usually does one each week. And one of the things he points out about this particular matter is that the new acting defense secretary, Shanahan was never defense secretary as such, he was always acting. The new acting is from another defense contractor. Right. I think it's
Raytheon or?
I think Raytheon is right.
Yeah.
The handoff here is one that doesn't suggest any fundamental change in policy at all, nor any diminution of the effectiveness in American policy of the military-industrial complex that we've talked about for more than a generation. It's particularly prominent in the Trump administration, which has the interesting characteristic of having active directors in a number of major, as many as a dozen major departments of government. Sinclair makes this point again this morning too, and one wonders a little bit quite what's going on there. One way to explain it is to say that with Trump not appointing directors for everything from Homeland Security to the Department of Defense, the deep state, if by the deep state you mean the bureaucracy, the ongoing permanent government of the United States, remains in place without any changes coming from the Trump administration. I think that's right. I've said before that I think that Trump is one of the weakest American presidents in modern history, and he makes up for it with a bluster and bombast, such as the range of tweets he sent out this morning. He's a good publicist, but perhaps a bad administrator, and that's much more important than the depredation, the complaints about his character that we get from all sides, really, in the American political establishment. There's a reason for that. The reason for the complaints about the character is that the American political establishment is afraid that Trump will actually act against the neoliberal and neoconservative policies that have animated all recent administrations. There are only little signs that he might do that. There's some question whether this morning's or overnight activity is another one of those signs, but I think it's far better to say that Trump is essentially irrelevant in spite of the bluster, and that this was the Pentagon versus the neocons in the American government, and for the moment at least, the Pentagon won.
I know that Jeffrey has a whole list of items about Joe Biden in his column this morning.
From the sublime to the ridiculous here now.
And just to relate whatever his character issues are with Donald Trump's, but notice that, I mean, the manner in which Biden's character issues are being treated in the mainstream media is, of course, very different than that of Donald Trump for obvious reasons. Biden, because it is the establishment view that Biden should replace Donald Trump in 2021. I guess the other little sidebar I would go there with is when we talk about the role of the military-industrial complex, I guess it was a term coined, it's allegedly coined by Eisenhower in his famous speech in 1960. When we talk about that, it's similar to the manner, it presents problems similar to the manner in which we talk about the power of the Israel lobby. I mean, what is really the role of is our defense policy, is our wars really motivated simply by defense industry or military armaments industry profits? And it's probably a better and more complicated question than that of the role, in my view, than that of the role of what the Israel lobby is, although there's even overlap there because Israel itself is so heavily invested in high-tech defense weaponry and drones and surveillance and all that stuff. But going back to World War I, it was pretty much conventional wisdom that it was the arms manufacturers that got us into World War I. That was the view in the 1920s that was put forward. I'm not sure if that view, I mean, it's often granted that that's what people felt. It's not, I've never really understood whether people feel that that's really why we got into World War I. I think that's a problematic statement also. But still, it's a more interesting question in some ways, what the role, the balance of the role of military weapons manufacturers are in wanting war, which obviously when you have a war, then you have to build more weapons to do that war. But whether that's really what elite interests, what motivates elite interests in getting us into these wars. For instance, whether it be Vietnam, or the Iraq War in either '91 or 2003.
The older I get, and for the moment at least I continue to do that, the older I get, the more I am aware of the extent to which my interests, political and otherwise, are occasioned by my parents' library. My parents didn't have an extensive library. It wasn't the fashion, I think, when I was young, to keep large numbers of books in a house unless you had a particularly large house and a traditional library. But my parents had a collection of things, including things that they had from college, things that they'd inherited from their parents, things that they'd picked up along the way in their own political and social development and whatnot. And there are a number of very strange things in that collection that I was excited by when I was quite young, including the poetry of Robert Service, which nobody else read at that time, and a book called Merchants of Death. Right. And remember, we're talking now about a good while ago. Merchants of Death was a book on just the subject David is talking about here, that is the arms manufacturers on both sides, on all sides, in the First World War. And it presented a popular view, a view that was widely shared, as you say, between the world wars, that it was the merchants of death, the arms manufacturers, who both promoted and profited from the bloodletting of the First World War. And I read that with interest, and I remember even the black and white photographs with which it was illustrated, photographs mainly of weapons. And the guy who wrote it was a young scholar at the University of Chicago, whose book produced a good deal of notoriety, and the circumstances of his death are interesting. Ooh. He was in the run-up to the Second World War in the 1930s. He was actually invited to Washington to talk about what had become a very popular book. It's not clear who invited him and exactly where he was going, and of course the Pentagon as a building hadn't been built yet, but there was obviously a military establishment in the U.S. that was interested in his views and mainly the popularity of his views. Remember, the primary contribution to human history, if you like, of the United States in the 20th century was its propaganda system. And that was clearly at stake here. The young author, whose name I cannot remember right now, but I will post information about it on the Facebook page for News from Neptune, died on the train on the way to Washington. He wasn't 40, I think. The circumstances of his death were regarded as strange, but as far as I know, there was no real investigation of what had happened and whether indeed he had been silenced by those who were interested in getting the U.S. Into the Second World War. And we have to remember the Second World War was going on for 2 years before the United States got into it, and it got into it precisely because of the Roosevelt administration's Fort Sumter move of placing the American Pacific Fleet in a place where it could be attacked. And the U.S. could then say that Japan had struck the first blow, and the Roosevelt administration could solve its principal problem, was that the majority of Americans had no interest in getting into the war. And it was an activity strangely similar in some ways to the one we're talking about from last night, that was bound up with a conflict in America between those who were pressing for war and the vast majority of the population that wasn't interested in the war. Some things don't change, and I think that basic structure remains there to this day, but the past is prologue, and what's to come in yours and mine is charge. Huh?
Is the show over so fast? Anyway, he always says that at the end of the show, in case you've never watched it before. But again, just to tie a bow on this to a certain extent. What we're talking about here is not whether we have conspiratorial views of how history works, but what kind of conspiracies are going on. Is it a conspiracy of the Israel lobby? It is a conspiracy of the weapons lobby or the military industrial lobby? Or is it a conspiracy of the ruling class to maintain its power? Is there a bigger picture there? We don't usually talk about the latter in terms of conspiracy theories. We simply talk about policy. But still, when you look at, for instance, the claims of WMDs in Iraq in 2003, there has to be a bit of a conspiracy there for such an outrageous claim to be believed by so many people, so many prominent people, as well as the mainstream press, or at least to allow for the possibility of that to be true, barring any real evidence, that as precedent to that war going down. So.
And the situation, once again, and the old motto, everything is connected. There are other matters involved here. There's not simply a specific issue involving Iran. Congress held hearings this week before the aborted, if that's what it was, attack on Iran, on the oversight of the Trump administration's Iran policy after the administration announced that it was sending 1,000 more troops to the Middle East. That's gotten lost in the discussion, particularly about Iran. But that's an account by the administration of what will be done next, what will be done in regard to American presence in the Middle East. 1,000 more troops. This is hardly new. Remember that when Barack Obama was elected as the peace candidate in 2008, his first major move to peace was not to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, but to send 30,000 more. So the pattern here remains much the same, and that's why I say Trump's actions may be basically irrelevant here, that what we're dealing with is a fight within the general context of American foreign policy between the Pentagon and the neocons. And remember, that foreign policy of the United States really is a century old. The basic foreign policy of the United States is that no peer competitors can arise in Eurasia, peer competitors or equals who might be able to interfere with America's money making from the Far East, from Europe, from Eurasia particularly. That was been the view of some, as I say, for more than a century, and it was the explicit view of the major thinkers, in quotes, of American foreign policy of the last generation, Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, who insisted that the fundamental point of American foreign policy was to make sure that no real rivals could arise and integrate economically Eurasia in a way that would interfere with the profits of the American 1%. That remains standard throughout the business. The unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s grew out of that conviction. And that conviction has not changed, and it remains the basis of what the U.S. is doing, in spite of disagreements on the mechanisms that will be employed to that end. The notion that there's a fundamental disagreement between the Obama administration and the Trump administration, evidenced by Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA, the Duke deal with Iran, is probably not right. This is a tactical dispute with an overall strategy that remains the same. The overall strategy is to make sure that the economic integration of Eurasia under anybody's auspices except ours doesn't occur. And what we have in the differences that Trump is insisting upon in his tweets overnight between his administration and Obama's administration is at best a difference in tactical conclusion on how this desirable situation, i.e. no competitors in Eurasia, is to be arrived at? Are the potential competitors like Iran to be sweet-talked into the overall framework of order, as the Obama administration seems to have insisted, or are they to be threatened to the point that they go away and don't bother us anymore, as the neocons in the Trump administration seem to want to do?
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the expression about Chile in 1973, that up until Allende's overthrow, the tactics was to make the economy scream.
Right.
And the differences between Obama and Trump, for instance, regarding Iran or even Venezuela, is that Trump or Trump's and his henchmen want to make, or hench persons, I should say, because we've got to include Gina Haspel among the
CIA.
among the henches.
Henches, yes.
Yeah, that
hench wench, I suppose.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, and that they want to make Iran scream a little more than Obama did, who removed some sanctions, but then again wasn't exactly inviting Iran back into the normal commerce of oil commerce of the Middle East.
Once again, on the line that everything is connected, it's also interesting to note that the departing acting defense secretary was a lobbyist for the Boeing company. The Boeing company has had some interesting problems of its own recently, including killing several hundred people with its faulty airplane, its 737 MAX or whatever they call it. And they have a lot of ground to cover, mainly public relations ground, because people, for some strange reason, don't want to fly in the 737 MAX because there are all those dead bodies lying around. In fact, the lobbyists from Boeing, like the departing acting defense secretary, are doing very nicely, thank you, with it. Boeing stock rose 5% in one day and received 200 new orders for the very plane, the 737 MAX, that caused these deaths on the grounds that governments have said, well, as far as we can tell, this plane's okay now.
Yeah, now I did read that, and that's confusing because what I read, this all has to do with the Paris Air Show,
right,
where these things are sold and these deals are made. At first, I read that it was only European Airbus, which makes planes that can actually stay up there, was benefiting from that because there was only orders for that, for something like 300 planes from whomever. And then all of a sudden, you're reading the British Airways are buying these 200 planes from Boeing. There's got to be some. This is, there's a backstory there as to what I mean. I would obviously I know nothing about this sort of thing, but let's double down on that Boeing 737.
The
MAX.
backstory is the competition between the Boeing and Airbus, and their willingness, in fact, to produce airplanes which have had this horrible recent record in the U.S. and then return to the commercial debate with basically nothing lost except all those dead bodies. Things are back to normal. Boeing and Airbus are competing, and they're trying to get orders from different countries around the world, and apparently they're getting them. So it's particularly disturbing because what government should be doing is not, obviously, guaranteeing the profits of the major aircraft manufacturers, but guaranteeing the safety of the passengers. And it's not at all clear they're doing that.
Yeah. So let's talk about Egypt here for a couple of minutes.
Egypt. Talk like an Egyptian.
Yeah, good. I'll try not to walk like one. Let's go back to July 3rd, 2013, after the overthrow of Mohammed Morsi, who died in prison, basically, after 6 years in prison, in the courtroom.
Right.
A thing that's been not really discussed. There haven't been any New York Times editorials about it, but they were editorializing back in its main writers anyway were editorializing back in 2013 after Morsi was overthrown and El-Sisi put into power. For instance, in an article on July 3rd, 2013, Ben Hubbard, who is a primary correspondent there in that region, wrote an article, "Military Reasserts Its Allegiance to Its Privileges," in which he wrote, "And suddenly Mr. Morsi, like his immediate predecessor, Hosni Mubarak, who'd been in power for 30 years, not 1 year,
Right.
discovered the enduring fact that the military, the Egyptian military, looks out for itself above all else. It is not ideological, but it is intensely politicized." That's New York Times speak for saying we don't want to deal with who wanted Morsi out of power and for what reasons. That was back in 2013. On the same day, David Kirkpatrick, the New York Times correspondent, wrote a little longer, excerpt from that. "Army ousts Egypt's president. Morsi is taken into military custody." Now, what I'm trying to get, let me cut to the chase here. What I'm trying to get at here is that the New York Times took a very balanced view towards this overthrow of Morsi a year after he was the first elected Arab president, a popularly elected Arab president. What Kirkpatrick wrote was, "The generals," meaning the people who took power, "built their case for intervention in a carefully orchestrated series of maneuvers, calling their actions an effort at national reconciliation, quote unquote, and refusing to call their takeover a coup." At a televised news conference late on Wednesday night, General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi said that the military had no interest in politics and was ousting Mr. Morsi because he had failed to fulfill, quote, "the hope for a national consensus," unquote. The generals stood on a broad stage flanked by Egypt's top Muslim and Christian clerics. They say Muslim clerics. Mohammed Morsi represented the Muslim Brotherhood. By Egypt's top Muslim and Christian clerics, as well as a spectrum of political leaders, including Mohammed al-Baradei, the Nobel Prize-winning diplomat and liberal icon, and Galal Mora, a prominent Islamist ultra-conservative or Salafi, all of whom endorsed the takeover. Despite their protestations, the move plunged the generals back into the center of political power for the second time in less than 3 years, following the ouster of President Hosni Mubarak in 2011. Their return threatened to cast a long shadow over future efforts to fulfill that revolution's promise of a credible civilian democracy. But General Sisi sought to present a very different image from the anonymous numbered communiques from the Supreme Court of the Armed Forces that were solemnly read over state television to announce Mubarak's exit. And then Sisi is quoted here back in 2013 when he took power. "The armed forces was the one to first announce it is out of politics," General Sisi said at the start. "It still is, and it will remain away from politics." Now we're 6 years later, and Morsi is dead. One more note here, and it's about a woman who's been writing for the New York Times for the last couple of years on a regular contributing op-ed basis. Her name is Mona Eltahawy, who came to prominence during that era as an Arab feminist woman who was interviewed on CNN throughout the coverage of this period, as well as by Amy Goodman and people like that on the left at that time. She wrote in a tweet in 2013, at the same time that these articles were being written, after Morsi was overthrown from power, she wrote in a tweet, "I haven't said enough about #Tamarud," the movement she was involved in, "women and men whose grassroots campaign inspired millions of Egyptians to protest versus Morsi. Great job." And she meant that sincerely in 2013. And what Ali Abu Nima wrote, either I think in a recent tweet commenting on Morsi's death in response to Eltahawy's 6-year-old tweet was, "Great job," sarcastically, to the fake movement Tamarod that fronted for the military coup that ended up jailing and killing Egypt's only ever elected president. Democracy, but only when it suits you. And a couple of other quotes were inserted and later removed from Mona Eltahawy's Twitter feed recently, her 2013 Twitter feed recently, complimenting the protest against Morsi, neither of whom are actually names, but one wrote, "You're such a hypocrite and frankly a monster. You cheered the brutal coup that brought down Egypt's only elected government. We haven't forgotten. For heaven's sakes, have you no shame?" And then another one wrote, "This is so far beyond ignorant, it actually gets paid in cash by Sisi." And Mona Eltahawy, I know this might be getting a little confusing, but she covered her rear end this past week, by saying the following: "Still, critics of Mr. Morsi," this is after Morsi's dead, "critics of Mr. Morsi, I was one of them, lamented that he was preoccupied with consolidating power for the Muslim Brotherhood movement from which he came, rather than acting as a transitional president as they elected him to be. For me, the most galling of Mr. Morsi's failures came in November 2012 when he issued a decree granting himself far-reaching powers, ostensibly aimed at ensuring the Islamist-dominated assembly set up to draft a new constitution could finish its work. Mr. Morsi soon upped the authoritarianism, there's that word authoritarianism, with another decree that authorized the armed forces to protect national institutions and polling places until Egyptians voted on a draft constitution the following month. Those who supported the revolution, especially its demand for the fall of the military regime, and not just one man from that regime, condemned Mr. Morsi for siding not with us, but with the very military that ended up deposing him." And then she concludes, "These tensions came to a head when millions of Egyptians took to the streets to demand Mr. Morsi's resignation on June 30th, 2013, the first anniversary of his taking office. After 3 days of mass protests, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, a man promoted by Mr. Morsi to head the military and to serve as defense minister, and who now is president, overthrew the Morsi government." So there's Mona Eltahawy, the fair-haired darling girl of the quote-unquote feminist Arab class, covering her rear end for what was actually the support of the overthrow of Morsi in 2013, and yes, putting in her 2 cents about, well, it hasn't been going exactly well since then, but shouldn't there be a little more reflection there on what is actually going on, as opposed to covering her own rear end?
And the upshot in the Middle East in general is that we have Egypt with its repressive military government right now joining in an effective alliance with Saudi Arabia and Israel, and an alliance that depends upon their client status with the United States for its construction. The vicious government in Egypt right now joins with the vicious government in Saudi Arabia and the vicious government in Israel in acting for the United States and its control of the Middle East, and all of these criminals sup together at the American table.
Yeah, the reason I started following down and got a little bit obsessed with this path this week was that I've started reading the Angry Arab's Twitter feed. I used to read his blog, and he went to Twitter, and I hadn't really been doing Twitter, or, I mean, you don't have to do Twitter, but But lately I realized, no, you have to read these people on Twitter because that's where they're writing now. And he also writes on Consortium News, and what he wrote,
which has been particularly good recently, and we recommend highly.
yeah, and what he wrote here in his column on Consortium News, the U.S. has built a complex network of local clients whose survival are not tied entirely to the despot, meaning El-Sisi. The U.S. now has organic links with the entire top brass of Arab militaries and with the leaders of the intelligence services. Those prove valuable to the U.S. and to Israeli occupation and the aim of peace between it and Arab countries. So this idea that somehow, when the Arab Spring happened, the Egyptian military, which had been identified with Nasser, of course, with Arab nationalism, was seen as the respected institution in Egypt, in their political culture, and now it plays on this idea that they're sort of above politics, that they're just caretaking the country while it descends into this chaos. Since Morsi was deposed in 2013, but of course, as you know, and this goes back to the idea that it's political, but it's politicized, but not ideological. That's only if you think that capitalism and American empire doesn't have ideological aspects to it.
You're watching News from Neptune. We have a few minutes left. I would bring up another comical figure, maybe is the way to put it. Roger Stone is a Republican publicist and operative who's been around since the glory days of Richard Nixon. And he is now emerged once again to actually take down the claim by the Russiagators that Russia hacked the Democratic National Committee's email servers. This is an important point, a real linchpin of recent discussions in American politics that ramifies throughout foreign policy and domestic policy, domestic electoral politics as well. Roger Stone's a joke. Consciously, he means to be a joke. But he, in this case, indicates something about a crucial point of the Mueller report, the Russiagate conspiracy, and the development of politics in the last several years in this country. A bit of background on this. The Democratic National Committee, at the time of the Mueller, or in the background to the Mueller report, the Democratic National Committee had hired a firm, a company, which calls itself an internet security agency, but looks much more like a PR firm, called CrowdStrike. This is an American business, an American company, that the DNC hired to investigate the alleged hack of its servers by the Russians. The hack that produced a vast range of emails that were eventually published by WikiLeaks was not investigated by the FBI, but rather by this group called CrowdStrike. The Democrats said, when the FBI said we wanted to find out about the where these emails that have been published on WikiLeaks came from, the Democrats said, that's all right, we'll do it. We'll do our own investigation because we've got our friends at CrowdStrike to do it. The servers that from which some Russians were alleged to have removed remotely copied emails over the internet, later to be released to WikiLeaks and later published in July of 2016. Evidence from Bill Binney, an interesting NSA former NSA employee, shows this is not how those emails got to WikiLeaks. And by the way, this is a fundamental point. If you look at the Mueller report begins with the notion that Russia hacked the Democratic National Committee and provided these emails to WikiLeaks. That's the heart of the Mueller notion of the Mueller report notion of the collusion in the 2016 election. The amount of data copied could not have been done the way the CrowdStrike group said it was done. The speed of copying matches that of a local copy to someone with a USB key, the same way you copy your own materials off your computer. In other words, it had to be done by someone who had access to those servers and was able to plug in a USB key. The Democratic National Committee emails were leaked, not hacked, were leaked from within the Democratic National Committee, not obtained remotely by Russians or anybody else. Seth Rich, the former DNC employee and later murder victim, was capable of copying such data as he had both the skill and the access needed to do the job. His murder in the midst of the campaign was so clumsily described by police, initially described as a robbery gone wrong on the streets of Washington, and never investigated fully, that it could be that the police are essentially cooperating with the hit against Rich as revenge because someone, presumably at the DNC, found out that Seth Rich was the source of the DNC emails to WikiLeaks. Now, it's amazing how this matter has been kicked around on all sides, and the insistence with which the political establishment, notably the Democrats, and the Mueller report, are that the obvious questions, who indeed hacked this email and why did they do it, those questions could not be asked. The DNC's claim that Russia hacked emails is falling apart today for the Democrats in a new way with the discovery in the Roger Stone lawsuit. Stone was a Trump campaign advisor, and information is emerging in his court case that many people in the Democratic Party particularly don't want to emerge. The U.S. government's evidence so far is lacking, likely because the entire set of allegations aren't true. Apparently, CrowdStrike prepared 3 draft reports, all with redactions. Stone's attorneys said the government does not possess unredacted CrowdStrike reports, i.e., the government doesn't have the basic information about the Russian hacking, which apparently didn't take place, of the DNC that the Mueller report and the entire Russiagate business is based upon. It's clear that the government has relied on the assumption made by a source outside of the U.S. intelligence community that the Russian state was involved in the hacking and that the data taken from the various servers were given to WikiLeaks. The government does not have the evidence when it applied for these search warrants. CrowdStrike never provided an unredacted report to the DNC. The FBI has apparently been content to never inspect the DNC servers, being satisfied with the copies of some data, server images, that CrowdStrike provided instead. We now see it accepting a redacted document which ostensibly describes, quote, steps taken to remediate the attack and to harden the DNC and DCCC system, part of the Democratic Party, systems against future attack, according to the government's response to Stone's motion to compel unredacted CrowdStrike reports. What's happening here is that the case against Roger Stone, this Republican operative, threatens to destroy the account that has been generally accepted of how this material got from the Democratic National Committee to WikiLeaks and what formed the basis of the notion that Russians had interfered with our election. It's a strange place for it to come from, but it's not coming from the logical places, the places that should be investigated. Now, this is parallel to the attempt that has been put forward by the acting Attorney General, Mr. Barr, to examine where the Russiagate investigation in the FBI originated. Who was it who wanted to find out about Russia's involvement with the Trump campaign? This turns the Russiagate investigation on its head, and the fact that something may come from that still is disturbing the sleep of some people in Washington, or so it seems.
You know, I sometimes I don't inform myself very well about people who have been in power in a certain way for a long time, especially if they're lawyers. And William Barr, I just really didn't know who was this man, William Barr, and where does he come from? And I confused him with Bob Barr, one time. I think I did it on the show actually. And I so I went and I just read the Wikipedia entry for William Barr, who turns out to actually be a whole 2 days younger than I am. So he's been around for a pretty long time, and he's been servicing the Republican Party, going back to Reagan and so forth. He is such a consummate political insider. I mean, I don't know if I'm not saying anything relevant necessarily to what you're saying.
No, it's absolutely right.
When you read about the lives, the kind of life that somebody like him has chosen to lead, without which supposedly involves the law, you just have to wonder what that all really means.
Here's a brief comment by Ray McGovern, the intelligence professionals for I can get the groups wrong. In any case, he was a CIA man for a long time in the Bush administration and is now one of the leading critics of things that are going on here. He writes, and I think quite correctly, there's no factual basis for the Russian hacking into the DNC computers. And now we know that the FBI went along with very spurious evidence with no claim of custody, evidence incomplete and redacted. The game was this. So as soon as the Democrats realized that Julian Assange had these messages, had the email from the Democrats, they composed a cover story. When Assange released those emails, went to the press was a willing accomplice and said, look, Russia did it. Russia gave the emails to Julian Assange. Assange denied it, but he tried to maintain WikiLeaks' reputation for not burning sources. In other words, he said that it was not a state actor which gave him the material. So the headlines were not Clinton steals nomination from Sanders, but rather the Russians hacked. And when did the Russians hack? Why isn't this an act of war? It worked like a charm. I call it a magnificent distraction, said Ray McGovern, distracted from what those emails actually showed, which was the stealing of the nomination by the Clinton people, to the question of, did the Russians get this stuff to Julian Assange? The answer is clearly no, and the actual conduit seems to be the murdered Seth Rich. But this literally couldn't be talked about in American media for the longest time.
Let me just interject one public announcement. There's going to be a meeting at the Champaign Public Library on Sunday at 1, and it's about single-payer health care, and it's about getting our senators, Durbin and Duckworth, to support that, and it's being sponsored by the local by many local groups, but it's being organized by the local chapter of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists, and there's quite a few people going to be speaking there that have a lot of experience with this issue. So that's Champaign Public Library this Sunday, the 23rd, at 1.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 25th week of 2019, a Killer's Trial edition. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scollery. See the research notes on the Facebook page for News from Neptune from J.B. Nicholson, a remarkably complete job. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue. Did somebody say this before? What to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.